Hello, Bend Design. It's great to be here on this virtual stage today in Bend, Oregon. And I'm Greg Hoffman. I'm here with Corey Martin. Corey is a creative leader today that's shaping the future of architecture in the Pacific Northwest and beyond that. And we've had the privilege to work together, and one of those collaborations is the High Desert House, where we are today, which is one of Corey's creations. And I'm biased because this is a home that I live in with my lovely family. So very lucky to know Corey, both as a collaborator and friend. And I think we're going to talk about this theme of drawing directly from landscape and nature to create built environments and experiences for people. And Corey, I thought we'd start with drawing in its literal sense based on that theme, and just hearing about you and your formative years and the role that art played and drawing and all sorts of disciplines from the artistic realm, and how that kind of brought you to where you are today.
Okay, so I began my career in art and making probably with drawing. And it was just something that I loved when I was a kid, and I spent an inordinate amount of time doing it. And I was growing up in Eugene, son of a jewelry designer and jewelry maker, both my grandma and my mom, and they had stores in Eugene and Portland. And my dad was a landscape architect. And so I think because of the combo of what they did, the tendency towards drawing, and then also kind of being exposed to what they were up to, which was, interestingly enough, landscape-inspired jewelry design and landscape architecture. I think even though I wasn't consciously absorbing it at the time, it was making an impact on me. So while I was drawing, I was seeing those forms around me and seeing the landscapes that they were inspired by, and I was experiencing them in person as well. They were taking me places, and I was seeing these things. And so as time moved on, as I matured and I grew up, drawing became something about connecting to the landscape, and it became literally drawing the landscape, and then also pulling ideas from the landscape into the art and sculpture that I began making more as an adult. And so I think that was a really important thing. And so as architecture has become prominent in my experience, I've combine this idea of drawing, literally, and drawing from the landscape with my passion for connecting people to the landscape.
That's great, and maybe that's why we had such a great time during the design of this house, because I also grew up drawing. My first passion was art, and that led me into a career within design and ultimately within innovation marketing on that. So I'm not sure I have the artistic chops that you had.
You did, but I remember. Yeah. I remember when we were interviewing with you, we were meeting, and we were here. You actually shared with me some of your early work before you worked at Nike, and so that was really cool. And so I think that was literally a connection where drawing became something that we all shared together.
Do you? So you obviously lead a pretty large team, and in regards to ensuring that your crew of architects and designers and developers, do you instill in them the importance of making sure that they're exercising their craft through other mediums, knowing that has such a great influence on architecture?
Definitely. There is kind of a conversation and a dialogue going on, though, right now, because technology is becoming so prominent in the way that we work and so powerful and compelling. And so as our kids and the students coming out of school are so good at and so adept at using those tools, it's even harder now to pull them back into this original kind of old school way of thinking about drawing and making as being an important part of what we do. But that said, I think, and you agree with this, drawing and physically making things is a way of thinking that is completely different than using a digital medium. And so when I came to the office was in a transition period of leadership in design, and it was a little bit more old school and had adapted to the new way of doing things. But I was coming from the standpoint of wanting architecture still to be a studio art practice. And so my small firm and my experience that I brought with me to the office was about making a lot of it. And so through that process, I think our whole office started reflecting on that. And my partner, David Kellner, the other design principal at the office, he saw that, and he's always been truly a maker and an artist himself. And he actually has run with it and now has been taking drawing classes about kind of freeing your preconceptions about making good art and good images and just focusing on the act itself, which is great. And then through that, we've encouraged our entire office to do the same thing and taken some of the same classes as a group. And again, we do that, and then we always kind of get pulled back into that conversation about what is the role of that in relationship to what the current media and tools are that we need to use to be efficient and do things in a really compelling way to share with our clients. And it's funny now when I think about even a pitch we're making to like a big tech company, like some sort of really important pitch, I think, how can we not do this digitally? And even today, I was on a phone call and I was thinking as I was talking to my project manager, maybe we could do this presentation next week all by hand, whether it's with words or just charcoal drawings or what have you, because I think they will see it and think, wow, that's interesting and different and more compelling. So
it's interesting you say that, because I remember back to the first, I'll call it an architecture presentation on this house, where we set up a meeting, we were the clients, expecting to see phase one drawings as one normally would. And instead it was basically one part history lesson, like the geographic history of Bend. I think you went back maybe 1 million years.
It's important. You gotta go deep.
Yeah, so kind of the volcanic kind of history of the geography here. And then the second part was storytelling through the series of gestural drawings. Rather than go right into floor plans and elevations, what I respected and really enjoyed was the fact that it was important to tell a story, and that the story would start with the history of the landscape here and how ultimately the solution would be a continuation of that story. Can you talk about how you approach that with a lot of your work?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is our firm has a way of thinking about the work that we do where we really want it to be meaningful no matter what we're doing, whether we're working in the city or in a really delicate, really sensitive landscape like the one that we're sitting in. We want whatever we do to be important and not high impact and of the place. And so as an outgrowth of that, for me personally, a lot of my work tying back into this idea of sensitivity and drawing from landscape has been focused on trying to figure out how we can create ways to connect people to the landscape through the design of spaces. So we think the best way to do that is to begin at the very beginning. And so that we can understand the history of the places that we're working in, whether it's a landscape or a city or an institution, whatever it might be, and just make sure that we really understand it as best we can. And then we do overlay this viewpoint of landscape and its importance, because I think we feel like it's a constant in the universe, and it's really important for us to feel like we're connected to it. And so that story, that ability to bring a story up from the beginning, I think has resulted in this idea of trying to find an architecture or ways of thinking about architecture that are really specific for Central Oregon. Because, again, I personally and our office as a whole have such a deep respect and love for this landscape. We feel like it's probably one of the most profoundly beautiful landscapes we've ever experienced. We really are motivated to try and figure out a way to make buildings that feel right here and feel like they're of this place. And I don't think we've necessarily reinvented the wheel. It's not that no one has ever done that. But when we look around at the buildings, especially the residential ones that tend to be built, they tend to come from other places. They tend to be imported, and they're more about the images of what I think people just want. And it's more of that kind of consumer way of thinking of things, and they just want a house that is whatever. And we want to make places that are of the place. And so we'd rather start from the very beginning to help everybody involved in a project come to some sort of consensus about what it is about this place that is unique and special, and how can we design a space for it. And there isn't just one answer.
Sure.
But that's the fun part, right? Is coming up with different ways and really being thoughtful about it.
That's great. And, there's certainly a consistent design vocabulary through your work. And I was just wondering, when I looked at, when you look at the forms and the lines and the proportions, certainly when you pull back and look at the portfolio of built environments, there's a strong formal design language, I would say. And just how intentional is that? I know it's certainly born out of the functional requirements of what a client may need, but clearly it's got to be conscious. And can you talk about that? And also maybe talk about the pitfalls of, especially to young architects or even students who are trying to push for a unique and ownable style, and trying to go there first before kind of looking at a lot of the other parameters that ultimately lead to something that's distinctive, as in sensitivity to the environment, clients' needs, etc.
Yeah, that's a complex question for sure, because there's so many aspects of it. I would say that there are aspects of the work that I've been involved in that are recognizable, probably, and that it is an outgrowth of a few things that are looked at from a point of view, for sure. And I think distilling ideas into their essence is a big part of that. Something that I think is important to me and to the work that we do is that it is just the right amount of moves in order for it to get done what we're trying to do. And I tend to see some work that has more moves, and I think I would like to remove something from it. And so this idea that we're distilling what we're doing down into its essence is really important. But that said, we've also done some fairly complex spatial things. Right. This house is an example. It's not that there's such an extreme minimalism happening. And so it's this idea of connecting to the place and kind of editing it just enough so that it's legible. And I think this art practice idea also is very prevalent in what we're doing. And the way of thinking about art that I've been involved in with sculpture is somewhat unique, because the idea of removing material when I'm sculpting is different than the idea of building up material. And I think that may be affecting, and we can talk about that in more detail, what is resulting in the work. I think for students that are kind of starting out, the thing that I would say for everybody is to spend time finding your voice. And for me, the way that I did that primarily is I left architecture. That's kind of like, I wouldn't say to everybody, just leave architecture to find your architectural voice. But for me, I worked at Allied Works and was involved in some amazing work there. And one of the projects being a land art project at the Maryhill Museum of Art. So it was all tying in for me to this idea of drawing from landscape at the time. But at the same time, for years, while I was working in architecture, I was maintaining a sculpture studio, and I was obsessed with it. So I just left architecture because I wanted to focus on that. And I spent 3 or 4 years working on that, just focusing, and that was a woodshed time. That was a time when my voice was developed, and it gave me a lot of confidence in what I'm doing now. And so I would say for anyone to find ways, you don't have to be that extreme, right? Of course. And still try and work to find ways where you're listening to your gut and you're trusting it and you're evolving those ideas and working them out to a level where you have confidence in them, right, so that you're not as affected by images you see and other people's work, that you're finding your voice. That is hard. Right? That's like life, lesson stuff. And I don't think I totally have the answer, but that's an important thing in design to anyone who's in design. So,
Yeah, you mentioned the woodshed, right?
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time within that, figuratively and literally. And this idea of subtraction and reduction through your kind of the years doing sculpture. But you also talked about wood carving and the influence that wood carving has had on your design methodology and how you approach the design process. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think I found that really, really interesting just in regards to the project that we were together.
And I think this project is exemplary of that tension between kind of two ways of thinking about making space. One is constructing space and building it. So building it out of objects and stacking them up or setting them up in relationship to each other. The other way that I think about it is about the idea like in wood carving where you're removing material to arrive at the final object. And for me, stacking things and making them is very willful and it's very, very intentional. And removing things is almost a process of surrender rather than that willful kind of idea. And so because when you're working with a piece of wood, you learn that it has all of its tensions within it. It has wood grain, it has soft spots, hard spots, and there actually sometimes is a form within that piece that will come out while you're working with it. It's a back and forth process, of course, and you need to listen to it. And so that, for me, has become paramount in how I think about space. When I think about the space that we're in right now, even though it is made up out of objects that are built in relation, I think of the idea from its original conception as a process of removing things from a starting form to arrive at what we have. And so the spaces inside are really the negative spaces that have been taken apart, and there are relationships between those spaces and the landscape, and between those spaces and us, and between those spaces from one to the next. It's kind of a reverse way of thinking about it that I think gives it some depth, which is very interesting. Also, I think projects like the Unitarian Church here in Bend are a really good example. That's a much different project than a house, of course, with a much more complex and varied and diverse set of clients. You know, our design committee for that project had 15 people on it. And our goal was, with almost every decision, was to get to a unanimous decision.
Wow.
So think about that.
It's a lot of cooks.
Right? A lot of
to create a meal.
And I think that building shows that. And at the same time, that building also is not just a building. It's a sculpture. And it's a building that has been designed with this more clearly, this idea of removing material to arrive at the final form. Right. So if you're from Bend or you're around, go look at the south side of that building. Go look at how it's been kind of carved up to get to where it is now. And so it's art, and that's that studio art making process that we've been talking about that's influencing the design of buildings. So
it's interesting because when I look at the Universalist Unitarian Fellowship building that you talked about, in one way, it's one of the most distinct buildings within the area, but at the same time, it feels more at home than everything else that's surrounding it.
Yeah.
And I think it does fit into that people's idea of what it means to live on the frontier and the images that they've grown up with and the lodge style aesthetic that is so prevalent here, but actually wasn't here, right? And I think then I see buildings like the Unitarian Church, and it does feel like it's in some ways born right out of the landscape and has been here in some ways long before us, if you will.
Yeah, and that's our hope. And I think that gets back to also this original idea of buildings and spaces being open, incomplete, and inviting too. That for me, when I see traditional kind of formal classical architecture, it makes me feel like I'm supposed to be reverent to it, and I'm looking up to it, and I'm smaller than it. And I've always felt weird about that. And so I think this building and that building are about creating something that is incomplete and inviting and porous and allows people in the landscape to both physically inhabit it, but also psychologically interpret it. Like, think about it in a different way than a building that's saying, I am a church. Right. Look at me. And also, that building, literally, the idea for that building came from the idea of a snag, of a weathered snag in this landscape that we're also familiar with, this beautiful silvered snags that we see around. There were many of them on that site, and that building was basically conceptually a snag that had been carved up for all of us to experience space within and shelter. So that exactly, right? You see it and it's like, well, that's because it was thought of as part of this landscape before anything else. And Unitarians are really connected to the landscape in the way that they think about what their purpose. And that was an opportunity for us to weave these stories together. And that's not normal. You know, it takes clients like you and them to be able to even conceptualize that being okay. And so it's about the alignments too.
I think part of it too is just wanting the perspective of knowing that there's something bigger than you. When you're living within nature, right, and you have environments and spaces that allow you to take that in and understand and get perspective from that. The only way that can happen is if you are able to sit within a space and have a connection to the landscape and the geography. If it's closed out, it does get back into the focal point is different. And I think that idea of becoming connected to each other within a space, part of the catalyst for that is your surrounding, the appreciation you have for the surrounding environment.
Yeah.
I think that brings people together, and that's that shared kind of passion people have for Central Oregon. Which I think when we talk about Central Oregon, you have to have a conversation about the natural light here. It's just simply spectacular. I think if you spend time in here, I think a lot of the audience has, it's simply hard to describe sometimes. And the fact that just 2-3 hours over the mountain range, you're in a utopia when it comes to natural light. So can you talk about how you go about harnessing and amplifying the light? Because I think the effect that has on the human experience is profound.
I agree. And that's, for me, it was early on a realization that the quality of light in our experience every day has a big impact on our mental well-being. And all joking aside, I used to say that was my goal, was to, in Portland, in the Valley, design buildings that could help people that have seasonal affective disorder, like really help people through the quality of light and the spaces that they're in. And then as we all go from east to west in Oregon, we understand that. It's really obvious, right? We come over here and there's a totally different quality of light. And I think when we're designing, the thing to think about is that in the Valley, again, there's a high glare over there because you have often these overcast days where light is just bouncing around everywhere, in every direction. The clouds are bouncing it. And so it's coming at you from all directions. And in a normal building, I'll say a normal building with a window, usually that window is put in the middle of a wall. And this gets back to kind of more traditional formal architecture too. And then in the Valley, that window looks like a bright spot in a dark wall. And so in the Valley, we thought about how can we reduce glare. That glare is kind of hard on your eyes and it's kind of stressful, right? And then just there isn't necessarily enough light. You're in a darker space with this bright spot looking at you. And so you have to think about how you design for that differently. And then in Central Oregon, completely different. Here, light is a form maker. It reveals form constantly, and you can draw with it. It's about contrast, and it's about movement and time. So this building is really a good example of that, because we designed in a way with this courtyard and trellis that we can measure time and measure sunlight by using it as a tool to draw within the architecture. And so instead of trying to seamlessly bring lots of light in to the spaces that we design in the Valley, here we might think about it as an opportunity to reduce the amount of light that comes in and then use it really specifically to do things. And so we get this really crisp quality of light here that I think Again, because of the lack of air, I think it's very different. Whereas again in Portland, there's much more reflection of that light coming through the atmosphere. Here it's very direct and crisp, and that gets into kind of all aspects of the landscape being very fresh and new and direct. And so again, here we're not trying to uplift people with light that don't have it. We're trying to make sure that people are sheltered and that space is made and that they can appreciate the light instead of just wanting all of it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's totally different. And I think that's another thing that I think architecturally speaking in Central Oregon, I think people may have missed just with the types of buildings that are built here. And so if you were designing a building in a cloudy Pacific Northwest landscape, I would think it would be totally different than in Central Oregon. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, well, it's interesting on that note. I think when we first started working together on this project, before you even put pencil to paper, if I recall, you camped out on the actual site, which I thought was, which thank you for that, because I do think that it showed, one, your sensitivity to the environment here. And then two, just that idea of how you use light to create the best experience for clients like us. And I assume the larger the space, the more important that is, because you're also trying to bring larger communities together. And certainly to me, having designed a lot of spaces for Nike and different stores and event spaces and pop-up spaces, at the end of the day, it's a feeling people need to have within an experience that can't be ignored. Like, that's the ultimate impact that you make. Beyond how it looks, it's the feeling and human experience that people have. And so I just think I wanted to kind of point that out. I thought I can't speak for many other architects, but the idea that you're literally not only living off the land, but living in the land before you start the project. And I have to imagine you've done that on some of your other sites. And so, Corey, one of the projects I wanted to talk about, because I think the audience would appreciate this, is the Lakeside building in Black Butte. And it's clearly a structure that obviously has won a lot of praise, but it's one that I think takes into account the whole history of that area and even the architecture within it, but also brings in something new and fresh and takes it forward to a different and better place. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's one of our favorite projects for sure, especially kind of our public larger projects. And because it ties all of what we're talking about together with spaces that anyone can experience. So anybody can go there and have a meal and what have you. What we like to say about that project is that we're evolving the architectural legacy of the main lodge area at Black Butte Ranch, because the ranch was developed in 1970 and there were some very iconic buildings built just around the site for that building. And they include some condominiums, the original lodge, and the original pool house. And so when they came to us, they had gone through a design process with another firm that had brought ideas about kind of what we're talking about, kind of these settlement buildings and these agricultural buildings and log cabins to the site. And we thought, okay, that doesn't really seem right. And so this is an opportunity to design something that truly connects to what is probably one of the best sites anywhere, especially in Central Oregon. The views there are amazing. The site on the ground is amazing. It lies in a really beautiful meadow between an upland forest and Black Butte itself that rolls down into this lake with unobstructed views of the Sisters. And so that building took that 1970s architecture and tried to evolve it and do some of the things that we're talking about connecting people more directly to the landscape. And so for us, that was a seminal project because it took all of these ideas that we're talking about and kind of blended them together into one project where it was drawing from landscape, it was of the landscape, it was evolving the history of the architecture there, and then at the same time it was helping people connect to the landscape in more meaningful ways. And so it frames the landscape so that you can consider it more directly and in different ways, and helps you notice things about it that you might not have noticed if there wasn't a building there. And what could be cooler than that is that the goal being is that you come there and your experience of that landscape is improved by having a building there instead of made worse, which is sometimes not the case. And so that project has provided us with a lot of food for thought about how we approach things in the future, including this project and others.
Yeah, a mantra I always used was creating something that's new and better versus new and different. Something that's different but not necessarily better, or doesn't improve someone's experience, is fleeting and really isn't going to probably stand the test of time. So, a lot of the audience, I believe, has either their own practices or they're trying to create a working culture within their firm or agency or brand, or are on the hook for leading their teams in the most inspirational way they can to create a culture of creativity and a culture of learning within their workspaces. And I know you and the Hacker team have created a new headquarters for Hacker Architects. And I'm just wondering, what was the thought process that you went through to make sure that you're creating spaces that kind of, walk the walk of everything else that you're creating for external clients, so that if I am a creative working within that environment, how are you empowering me to deliver my best work, to collaborate better, to be inspired?
That's a great question. I think that because we just went through it and we just, as you said, built this office and then got to occupy it for a few weeks as the kind of ideal space that's just beginning to be used a little bit, and then COVID hit. And so we've been away from it now. So it's been providing a lot of reflection on how that space can improve our work, even more so. So I just want to also remind everyone that, this is a collective effort. And to your point, that our job as a firm is to find the ways to empower our staff to be able to collaborate in their own most effective way. Because I do not do all of the work. I do not detail all of the work. I do not design every little piece of every project. I'm here as a leader to help everyone else kind of do their best work and make sure that we're on the track to kind of delivering the vision that we all want to with our work. And so on that note, we set out to design our ideal office space. One thing that's really important about it is that it's a mass timber building, and that we're leaders in the nation right now with the design of cross-laminated timber buildings and offices built in cross-laminated timber especially. And so we decided to go for it ourselves. And so we're designing a really humane space built in a really sustainable material in an innovative way that ideally can empower and inspire people to do their best work, because it's a very uplifting, light-filled, healthy space that operates on biophilic principles of nature improving all of our productivity and happiness. So that was paramount. Secondly, because of these ideas of drawing and bringing in other forms of media into the design process, we structured the design of the space around a series of large walls so that everyone in the office, every team had access to a pinup space, because architecture is visual. We noticed that in our previous offices, a couple of them, we didn't have enough space for people to share the work that they've been doing. And that over time, people felt isolated from other project teams and kind of unaware and less connected to the work than we wanted them to. And so on this idea of seeing the work, being able to work at a large scale, being able to draw at a large scale and use your body, because if you're not using your body, I learned this through my time at working in sculpture, that if you're not drawing at a large scale that kind of challenges the size of your own body, you're missing something. And so we're providing an opportunity. If people want to, they can take this idea of drawing into the process. We've also combined it with the digital aspect of our work. So we're projecting images on these large walls. People can draw over the images. They can pin up images, review 3D models, and all of those things. So it's kind of a combination of these two ways of thinking about our work. And we're trying to create this ideal hybrid of work. We haven't actually gotten to really test it out. We just started, and then boom. So we're looking forward to that because we feel that there's kind of a missing piece in our industry of people being really connected to each other and to kind of their own ability to generate their ideal work. And so the space is designed to do that. And so I would say that for anyone in our world, whether it's at a scale of a 70-person office like ours or just a couple of people, try and think about ways that you can look at your work from all aspects and think about how your space can inform how you're working. Because without that, you're limiting yourself.
Sure.
Right?
And I have to imagine it also leads to greater creative confidence. This idea of not being afraid to fail, getting your work up at that scale in front of everybody, getting used to that, and not searching for perfection each and every time. I think that ultimately does build future leaders that can go on and kind of pay it forward to the next generation. Which, when we think about the next generation, there's a time and a moment we're in right now where we really have to recognize how underrepresented certain communities are within not just architecture, but the design disciplines in general, the creative disciplines.
Yeah.
And certainly Black architects, Black designers are underrepresented and in a lot of ways underserved, and even externally in terms of serving minority communities through architecture and design is also something that we have to spend a lot of time thinking about. So I know you and the team at Hacker have had the opportunity to be a part of certain programs that I feel are, creating a greater level of awareness and greater opportunities to truly have a diverse and inclusive practice, both not just within Oregon, but nationally and internationally. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. This is, of course, super important right now and more than it's ever been a focus of all of ours. But that said, several years ago, one of our employees brought an idea to us about starting a program for underserved youth, basically in North Portland, to expose them to the design professions, to urban design, planning, architecture, and what have you. And we supported it wholeheartedly. And so I think that's something about our office that is maybe different. I think there's a kind of, again, a deep desire to serve humanity with whatever we do, whether it's the design. And I'd love to talk about how that can connect to this idea as well. But this program that he begun, it's called Your Street, Your Voice, and it's now expanded and kind of grown into becoming managed by others. It's not just Joe anymore. And so it's grown into full-on legitimate operation. And the great thing about it is that there are a few students who we've had intern in our office from the program that were just high school kids when they began. They did studio classes through the program. They interned with us, and then one of them, who we have working with us now, he actually went on to apply to architecture school, and he's going to U of O, which is great. It's a tiny little thing. But I think it's a good model for the opportunity that those kinds of activities represent. The thing that's really cool about it to me right now is that rather than just being about design, they're talking about it now. If you go to their website, you can see it. They're talking about design as a tool for racial justice, which is a big deal. And so our office also, partly as an outgrowth of this, and partly just because of our collective desire to serve, I think we've been doing a lot of research and a lot of learning right now about how design can impact people of color. And so we don't have the answers yet. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things about design right now that we all take for granted, about security and privacy, that I think definitely have historically targeted people of color, and we don't even realize it. Like just, again, that design of formal entries to buildings, security systems. There are aspects of SEPTED in design that are basically kind of some people see as the kind of most basic way of making sure that buildings and public buildings are secure and safe. But really, when you look at what they've kind of legislated into these ideas, they impact people negatively. And so we don't want to say to a facilities manager at a university or institution that that's not okay for people to be safe. But how can we design buildings that don't do the things that those standards are asking? And so this idea of openness and incompleteness to me is a big one when I just think about design. And the fact that when you think about space as something that rather than it being contained, that if it fundamentally is open, you're already thinking about how design can be more welcoming. And so it ties all the way from our policies and hiring and helping to reach out to people, but also into the actual physical things that we're all designing. And so that's what we're just beginning to conceptualize, is how can the physical form of the buildings and spaces we're designing impact people in positive ways? We don't know the answer yet, but I think it's important, and it's actually really exciting.
Absolutely.
Because it's giving more meaning to what we do. Now, our strategic plan is another thing that I think we're working on right now, a new strategic plan. Every 3 to 5 years, we go through this process of kind of redirecting and goal setting, right? And so now, diversity, equity, inclusion is being elevated as, kind of one of the main points of our strategic plan. We don't know what that means yet or how it's going to impact what we do specifically yet, but we're elevating it. And I think everybody needs to do the same. Like, no longer just talk about what markets are we going to be in and what kind of work do we want to do and how are we going to get the work done. We're going to say, how does everything we do impact diversity in all of the work that we do? So
that's great. Because it does. It's great to hear, and it does start with commitments, written commitments, right? Based on what you've heard, what you've learned, the voices you've listened to, and certainly within the creative fields. Creativity, diversity within the creative process leads to greater empathy, and if you have that empathy, your ability as a core attribute of and trait of a practice or a discipline like architecture, then you have a far greater success rate in terms of reaching communities that don't historically get the benefits of great design, great architect, and when I say design, I mean in the largest sense, designing communities and programs and infrastructure. Part of what gets us there is first, back to the commitments, trying to create more diverse and inclusive teams up front, because it allows you to see maybe what everybody else sees, but you're able to find the opportunities that exist that others can't find. And that comes from having a diverse workspace. So
that's listening, right? When that's what we're really working on now, and I think that's what the professions all need to do, is find ways to get those voices into the conversation. Our public projects, like we're working with PCC right now in Portland, and critical race theory was a big part of the most recent project that we're working on. And that was a whole long kind of beginning of the project before any real pencil was put to paper. And that's because they're a public institution, right? So how do we bring that to our internal strategic planning or what have you, and our hiring practices and all that? We're really proud that we have much more diversity than we had 5-8 years ago. It's great to look in the office, but it's still nothing. And our leadership is still all white. Like, it's not diverse. So it's not better yet. It's kind of on the way, and I think that's the challenge that these professions see. I think another thing with bringing up kids in an environment where they understand architecture is important is to broaden the definition of design, right, in architecture and planning and things, to all design. And I think the way that I want to think about it is that, all design is relevant, whether it's shoes, apparel, industrial design, and it's something that everybody notices. And once they start noticing that, and that's easier to get kids to kind of notice, right, those things that they interact with. And once they have that concept, they can start broadening that view to the spaces around them. And once that clicks for people, it's a big deal, because I remember that for myself. Like when I realized that this space that we're in is the stage on which everything happens that we experience in our lives. I think when kids realize that, and when they realize they can actually improve the issues that they really care about now. So like, right? Racial justice right now, like, can they use architecture to improve that? Once they see that, I think more kids are going to want to get into those professions. That's the hope, but it's not going to happen instantly. And I think, how do we get it to happen faster? Just don't. It's really hard. It's taken such a long time to become what it is. Is it going to take just as long to undo it? I hope not. Right?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about the future. Of course, when I look at the young generation of today and the conviction that they have for doing what's right, the self-belief and confidence, the creative tools that they have at their disposal, I think that maybe we didn't have kind of coming up in this game. And then with the right forums to be able to express themselves and also learn from all kinds of talented folks like yourself. So I'm very bullish on the future, and we're in a moment in time where I think design with a capital D, needs to lead and is more than willing to lead, and you're seeing that everywhere. And I think the power of collaboration is important within that. I think to make great change at scale, it is something we all have to work together to achieve things that truly stick and are lasting, versus simply inspiration or stories for the moment. I think is really important.
Yeah.
So, well, it's been a great conversation, Corey. I think ending on this subject is both timely and right. And I wanted to hit you up on some of the other things I wanted to see get done within the house. Can I talk? Wait, I'm not going to bore yeah, there you go. I'm not going to put the audience through that. But it's been a pleasure, and certainly I'm happy to call you a friend. And I hope in the future we can work together again on something.
Let's do it.
And I hope that the audience is inspired by your methodology and ethos and the hacker team's approach to architecture. And maybe they'll also have the opportunity to work with you live in the future.
Thanks, Greg.
Cheers.
Okay.